There are many technologies that change the way people live, but only a rare few that change the way the world at large actually works. The reason is simple. Geography is static. Only a precious few technologies fundamentally alter how peoples interact with their geography. Either you have a river and can trade locally and cheaply and build your regional identity and capital base, or you don't, and you remain unaffiliated and poor. Either you live in the mountains and are isolated from others culturally and militarily and have an independent streak, or you're part of the ebb and flow and rise and fall of empires. In the main, these are the ways that geography has shaped human experience. But there are a few technological packages that have been so successful and far-reaching in their implementation that they have changed the rules of how peoples and nations interact. These few packages have come to define the age of the day. As you may have guessed from the previous chapter, sedentary agriculture makes the short list of transformative technologies. Irrigation and crop differentiation took humans from the hunter-gatherer lifestyle to modifying the land itself in order to produce greater concentrations of what humans wanted, on time schedules that were sufficiently reliable to allow for settlement. Once crop cycles were hammered out, populations could grow and provide spare labor to build roads, walls, buildings, and everything else that makes civilization worthy of the name. Beginning around 6000 BC, the secrets of agriculture radiated outward from places like Egypt and Mesopotamia, and their adoption created the groundswell of civilizations, interactions, and competitions of the ancient world. Many of the technologies developed over the course of the first 5 millennia allowed humans to improve upon agriculture. But none resulted in the fundamental shift in circumstance that agriculture did. Copper and iron increased productivity as compared to wood and stone. Cannon and muskets increased range and lethality, and required changes in battle tactics. The details, all of the details changed. But the core that stability and power came from a robust, secure, and sustainable food supply remained. It wasn't until the past half-millennium that 2 packages of technologies, in sequence, radically altered the human condition. But before we launch into the first, it is critical to understand the shape of the world the day before the next transformative technology changed everything. The Ottoman Empire, the nearly superpower. Keep in mind the balance of transport. Moving stuff is hard, and moving stuff by water is easier than moving stuff by land. Successful countries tend to be those that boast robust options for maritime transport, but that maritime transport has to be of a fairly specific type. In the world before 1400, true ocean transport was a rare thing, being neither quick, nor reliable, nor safe. The problem was sight. Once line of sight to the land was lost, you had to more or less guess where you were and what heading might take you to where you needed to go and hope that you would make landfall before exhausting your supplies or before the weather turned and the sea swallowed you up. The need to keep land in sight sharply limited long-range voyages, as coastal peoples often had opinions about who would be allowed to sail along their coasts. In this era, nearly all of the major durable powers fell into one of 2 categories. The first were powers with navigable rivers that could easily extend their cultural reach up and down the river valley, enriching themselves with local trade, and use the resources of their larger footprint to protect themselves from, or force themselves upon, rivals. The second were powers that lived on seas sufficiently enclosed that they were difficult to get lost within. These seas didn't work quite as well as rivers, but they certainly blunted the dangers of the open ocean and allowed for regional transport and trade. France, Poland, Russia, and a few of the Chinese empires fell into the first category, while the Swedes, Danes, Phoenicians, and Japanese fell into the second. In this pre-oceanic shipping era, one country nearly emerged as the European hegemon, largely because it qualified for both baskets and did so in a way bigger than other powers. The Ottoman Empire originated on the shores of the Sea of Marmara, a nearly enclosed sea small enough that it functioned as a river in terms of facilitating cultural unification, but large enough that it allowed for a reasonable volume of regional trade. And Marmara didn't exist in isolation. To its northeast was the Black Sea, while to its southwest lay the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean, all three enclosed bodies of water that the Ottomans were able to use their naval acumen to dominate. Emptying into the western Black Sea was the Danube, by far Europe's largest river, which allowed the Ottomans to expand as far north into Europe as Vienna. By measures of the day, the Ottomans had within easy reach more useful land, river, and sea than any other power, and nearly more than all of their European rivals combined. And then there was trade. From their home base at the supremely well-positioned Istanbul, the Ottomans dominated all land and sea trade between Europe and Asia, and from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. The largest and most lucrative of those trade routes was the famous Silk Road, the source of all spices that made it to Europe. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, mace, cumin, and saffron might seem like minor luxuries today, but their only sources were in South and Southeast Asia. Between the unreliable nature of ocean transport and the yet-to-be-mapped African continent, there was no reliable all-water route. The only way to access Asian spices was for the Silk Road to traverse China, Central Asia, Persia, and ultimately Ottoman-controlled lands. Between the hundreds of middlemen, the sheer distances involved, and the hefty tax the Islamic Ottomans placed on spice transfers to Christian Europe, upper-class Europeans often spent as much on spices as they did on food. In a matter somewhat similar to that of contemporary Arab oil states, the spice trade perennially transferred massive volumes of wealth from Europe to the Turks. Benefiting from the most strategic location on the planet, Europe's longest river, 3 manageable seas, and the most profitable trade routes of the time, the Ottomans came but one battle away from dominating all of mainland Europe. In 1529, they laid siege to Vienna at the head of the Danube Valley. Had they won, they would have been able to pour an empire's worth of resources through the gap between the Alps and Carpathians onto the North European plain, a wide highway within which the Turks would have faced no barriers to conquest. But they failed, because the world had changed. Deepwater Navigation 1. Expanding the field. While the Turks were making their bid for hegemony in the 15th and 16th centuries, a technological revolution was altering how people and countries interacted not just with each other, but with their geography. Lands that languished in the Old World began prospering in the New. The converse proved true as well. The new technologies transformed the Sea of Marmara from the richest and most secure topography on the planet to a backwater, condemning the Ottoman Empire to a slow-motion collapse. Collectively, the new technologies ended ocean shipping's likelihood of being a near-death, or worse, experience. Compass, 14th century. Never underestimate the importance of being able to know which direction you are going. Extensive cloud cover plagues much of Western Europe and its surrounding seas, particularly from October to March. Being bereft of sun or stars while plying the English Channel, the Bay of Biscay, and the Mediterranean was a risky business, and so naval shipping tended to be seasonal to avoid cloudy skies and the uncertainty they generated. The compass made sunny days less a requirement and extended shipping seasons, for example, allowing Italian merchants to make 2 annual convoy trips to the Levantine coast to pick up spices rather than 1. The initial design of the compass probably dates back to 11th century China, but it was not until the 14th century that the Europeans were able to develop a dry compass. Earlier versions floated a magnetized metal filament on water, making them impractical in anything but the mildest of seas. Crossstaff, 15th century. Once you know what direction you are going, you need to know where you are. A crossstaff is a simple pole with a sliding crossbar that could be used to measure the angle between a known celestial object and the horizon, enabling its user to determine his latitude. A later version, the backstaff, 1594, allowed the same process without having to look at the object in question, which was often the eye-searing sun. In time, the technology evolved into the Mariner's Astrolabe and the Davis Quadrant. Combine the cross or backstaff with the compass, and captains could consult the wind speed and estimate their locations out of sight of land. Carvel technique, 15th century. Dark Age vessels were constructed with a series of overlapping planks held together with pegs. The design was simple, but the ships were both heavy and difficult to repair, which drastically limited their speed, cargo capacity, and seaworthiness. The carvel process instead laid down a frame of wooden ribs to which exterior planks were attached, eliminating pegs completely. The result was a ship design that was lighter, faster, safer, and easier to scale up. The scaling up proved particularly important for trade vessels. Now not only could they transport far larger cargoes, but their sides would also be high enough that even the waves of raging Atlantic storms could not crash onto their decks and founder them. The only downside was that the new technique required far more skill than the traditional peg or clinker vessels to craft. This drastically slowed its adoption, allowing those few nations that commanded the appropriate skill sets to dominate global commerce for over a century. Gunport, circa 1500. Naval guns and supporting equipment are extremely heavy, and storing them on the deck not only created extreme safety hazards, but also often caused ships to founder. Consequently, it was rare for any vessel to have more than a handful of guns, which could only be stationed on the prow. The gunport allowed the guns to be stored and fired from below decks. This lowered a ship's center of gravity considerably, making it far easier to avoid capsizing while keeping the guns at a remove from potential boarders. You could just close the port. It also allowed guns to be mounted all along the side of the ship, increasing the potential firepower of a vessel by a factor of 20 and allowing a single ship to ruin almost anyone's day. Nearly all of these technologies were developed, refined, and operationalized by two countries that had almost nothing to do with the Ottomans. Europe's westernmost peninsula is Iberia. At the time of the Ottoman rise, the peoples of Iberia, the Portuguese and Spanish, had very little going for them. Nearly alone among the major European regions, Iberia has no rivers of meaningful length and only very narrow coastal strips, forcing most of its people to live in a series of elevated valleys. Unsurprisingly, in the 1300s, Iberia was Europe's poorest region. It also didn't help that the two had borne the brunt of the Arab invasion, being occupied by the Moors for nearly 7 centuries. But it wasn't their poverty or history that induced them to turn the page of technological history. It was their location. Being at the far western end of the continent meant that the Iberians had to recruit additional middlemen, typically either the French government or Italian traders, to access the spice trade. The additional step pushed up the price even more, not to mention making their spice supplies beholden to the politics of often hostile powers. They had a stark choice to make: suffer on as Europe's laggards, or devise a means of changing the game. They needed to find a way to bypass the Ottomans, bypass the Italians, bypass the pirates, bypass the known world in its entirety. Their solution was deep water navigation.